This evening we're looking at canal planning and conservation in the West London. Although this is based in West London, the evening is designed to encourage us all to get involved in planning and conservation in our own areas in order to protect our waterways heritage and the rights of navigation. London Region has a planning and conservation subcommittee, and I'm pleased to welcome Ray Gill, Chairman of this committee and Planning Officer for West London Branch, and also Roger Still, Chairman of West London Branch, to speak to us this evening. We'll start with Ray, and so over to you, Ray. Thank you.
Thank you, Libby. Planning and conservation is a huge subject to tackle in about 40 minutes. So we've divided this into 3 sections. I'm going to start by talking about the background to planning in West London, and then look at 1 or 2 more difficult planning issues that we've had with planning applications. And then finally, Roger Still is going to come in and talk about the future that we face with the planning issues over the next 10 years or so. Robert Aitman, co-founder of the IWA. This is the first floor living room of his house in Gower Street. It's where the inaugural meeting of the association was held, and it became known as the Waterways Room. It was, if you like, the nerve centre of the new organisation until about 1948. And I've put this slide in as planning, the environment, conservation, heritage were all at the core of the IWA campaign objectives from the very beginning. Aitman discovered the canals not by boating, but by walking the then abandoned Stratford-upon-Avon Canal in the 1930s. Boating and the right of navigation were the levers to keep the canals open, but there was much more to it than that. The early campaigners saw the waterways as a national resource, a corridor open to all that connected rural countryside with urban environments. Aitman actually put this much more powerfully and succinctly with this often used remark. And it is, of course, particularly relevant to the canals of West London. So this map shows our canals of the West London branch superimposed on a Google map. And what it indicates is that the canals really to the east, the Paddington Arm in the main, really run through, and I hope you can see I may use my cursor during this talk, you see my cursor moving around. The Paddington Arm is largely through urban areas. There are 1 or 2 quite large areas of green, particularly around Horsedon Hill here, and also between Hanwell Flight and Brentford, where the Brent River Park is, and Boston Manor Park. And then further to the west, the Slough Arm is very rural indeed. It goes through here. And as we go north through Oxbridge, we come into the Colne Valley Regional Park and up as far as Stocker's Lock. So the context is, as you see there, 36 miles of canal. We have 9 local authorities which we have to deal with in terms of planning. And also there is, in addition, the Old Oak and Park Royal Development Corporation, which I'll come on to later. 23 conservation areas within our area, and quite different approaches. For instance, Ealing has put all of its canal into one linear conservation area, whereas Hillingdon has actually adopted an approach where they've largely taken areas around locks with groups of buildings, sort of isolated conservation areas. And then we've got 15 miles of canal within Greenbelt, and that's very important because it offers perhaps more protection than conservation areas do, because there is a presumption against any kind of development unless it's a replacement of an existing building on a like-for-like basis in terms of area. Well, fingers on buzzers, your starter for 10. These are just some of the very large companies that used to occupy canal side sites in West London, and they've now all gone, leaving really behind derelict and vacant sites, effectively what's known as brownfield sites. Basildon Bond, I've cheated slightly, and also Roses, they're further north. Basildon Bond is the Dickinson's mill up at Croxley, and Apsley, and Roses, of course, at Hemel Hempstead. But both those companies used to transship their raw materials at Brentford Dock, and bring raw materials up the canal by narrowboat. And this map really confirms that. This is between Brentford and West Drayton, and a historic map showing the numbers of docks that used to exist and all the sort of companies that were based around these docks, all of which have now gone. So the development pressures that we have, a large number of industrial sites, brownfield, as I said, and of course, ideal for redevelopment. And large numbers of housing are needed, and they're set out in both central government targets and the Greater London Authority housing targets. They wish to build about 65, or did, 65,000 houses per year in the Greater London area. And then we have, with these larger schemes, very sophisticated developers, people like Ballymore or the Berkeley Group, and they come with an army of consultants, and they're highly practiced in operating in difficult planning environments, so they know what they're doing. And then finally, we've got a couple of nationally significant infrastructure projects, and I'll come on to those in a minute. Now, London was in a strange position for about 14 years before the millennium, when there was really no strategic planning authority that covered the whole of London. And that changed with the setting up of the Greater London Authority. And the first London plan came out in 2004, and it's been updated since. And this is an overarching strategic plan for London, really to take account of the increase in population up to about 10.9 million by 2041. And it establishes some very important waterway policies, particularly Chapter 9. And those policies are probably in much more detail than the local plans of the individual boroughs. And of course, this document takes precedence over anything in the local plans. So this is one that we look at very closely as we go through applications. Now, I mentioned the nationally important infrastructure projects. They're dealt with in a completely different way to normal applications. There's a 6-stage process that they go through, and they're really determined by the planning inspectorate. And once their report is done, either approving or not, then that's ratified by the Secretary of State. And we have two. And this first one is the Heathrow expansion, the proposed 3rd runway, which there was a consultation last year, and we submitted a detailed response to that. And our major concern, along with a lot of other people, and if you can see my cursor here, was the 3rd runway itself extending over the M25, which was going to take something like 900 acres out of the Colne Valley Regional Park. And this park is important because it's a wildlife corridor between the Thames Basin, going all the way up and into the Chilterns. And the potential was here, apart from the pollution issues and noise, was that the 3rd runway would have a major impact on that corridor. The other one is Speed Hs2, really started in 2009. At that time, we were concerned that the railway coming out of London would have a major effect on what's known as the Northolt Corridor. But by 2012, the decision was taken to really put the railways virtually through West London in a tunnel. And that tunnel emerges down here, and the dark dotted line is the line of a viaduct which runs across the Colne Valley and over the Grand Union Canal here, and then it goes back into a tunnel through the Chilterns. And of course, this is not, again, not a normal planning process. HS2 received their planning consent by the High Speed Rail Act of 2017. And this is what's known as a Section 17 application, where they submit design details to the local authorities for approval. And this is part of the application for the Colne Valley. And this shows the viaduct crossing the canal. And actually a bit further south from here, there is a large railway, very magnificent railway bridge in brick. So these two structures will almost read together. Old Oak Park Royal Development Corporation, this was set up in 2015, and it's about 650 acres. And again, you can see the canal, if I can move my cursor around, which runs right through the middle of it, through here, through Old Oak, and on into Kensal Green. And what is proposed here is a major interchange at Old Oak Common Station. And the interchange is between Crossrail and HS2. And that will be built here just to the north of Wormwood Scrubs. And that was really the thing that triggered this whole decision to regenerate this area, specifically in Old Oak here and in Park Royal on this side. So the vision here was for a great number of new homes, new jobs, and a new commercial centre, largely offices, retail and flats. And this is an image they produced in 2015 with a bridge here crossing the canal. This is called Grand Union Square. And keep this image in mind, because what I come on to next is quite important. And of course, no loss of employment in the Park Royal area. They wanted that to remain as an employment area. So since 2015, a number of really significant problems have happened with this regeneration. The first of which is shown in this view at the top here. This shows an image of the new station, a series of barrel vaulted roofs over the concourse. And in the foreground here, next to the canal, is the Elizabeth Line Crossrail maintenance depot. Now, originally it was intended that that would be decked over to allow the development of this new, effectively, town centre that you saw in the slide earlier. But unfortunately, it was never constructed that way. So the Crossrail depot is there to stay for the moment, and nothing really will happen on that site. The other thing, of course, that happened was a delay in proceeding with HS2. There was a review on costs, and it wasn't until February of this year that the government gave the go-ahead. And then finally, the OPDC produced their own local plan, which has been in review by the Planning Inspectorate. And the Planning Inspector's report decided that the car giant business, which is in Old Oak North, was a sustainable business and should stay. So again, there was another huge area of land that's been lost to potential new housing. And that looks as though it means that Park Royal actually will have more housing. And that may mean that the industrial areas in Park Royal will be intensified in order to create land for that housing. Another aspect of this is a number of schemes that have already been approved in OPDC. This one is at the end of Scrubs Lane, and there's the tower you see in the middle there. And this is a wireframe image of what might have happened in Old Oak South and Old Oak North. And it looks likely now that that won't happen for a considerable number of years. So these sort of developments that already have planning permission may stay as rather isolated tall buildings along the canal. So I'll move on to some of the planning battles we've had, but before I do that, I thought I'd just talk briefly about the process we go through in terms of monitoring and commenting on planning applications. The IWA is not a statutory consultee, so we are not automatically notified about planning applications, but the Canal and River Trust is. So they get notices sent to them by the planning authorities, and they put them on their website every week. And so this is the method that we go through, and I log all of these gradually. And you can see here, there's one for Hillingdon. There's usually about 5 pages of this every week, luckily in alphabetical order in terms of the authority. And having got the reference, the planning reference, of course, then we go on the planning site for each local authority, and then we can call up the documents. This one is quite, this one is 71 documents in Brent, but sometimes they run to well over 100. And so there's quite a lot of work to plough through all of these documents to see exactly what is proposed, what the uses are, how big it is. The key document is very often the design and access statement, which shows you computer images of the development and the reasoning about the way it's been designed. So I'll move on to a number of applications, and this one goes back really to 2012, and this is the Bulls Bridge conservation area, and this is where the Paddington Arm meets the main line of the Grand Union. And this is a site that was totally in the ownership of British Waterways Board in those days. And the building on it was the toll house, which was not listed, although the bridge there is listed grade 2. This isn't listed, but it is on a local list for the local authority. What that means is, although it's not statutory protection, it doesn't mean that there is a presumption that the building couldn't be demolished, that it would have to be refurbished. And so an application was made in 2013. But prior to that, in 2012, I imagine just weeks before all of the assets of British Waterways Board were transferred to the new Canal and River Trust, this site was sold to a developer. And for one reason or other, he sold it on then to a hauler who wanted to use it for concrete mixing and a lorry park. And here you see they'd stripped the roof of its slates. They hadn't got permission, they'd put an application in and the building was scaffolded. And then later that year, to my horror, when I looked at the site again, the roof had been removed entirely and they were building a mansarded roof, obviously with the intention of a third floor of accommodation. And I contacted Hillingdon straight away and was told that a stop notice was being issued and an enforcement notice was taken out. And so later on, it gradually got back, that roof was removed and we got back to this, where they'd replaced the original roof profile in slate. The windows have been removed. And then finally in 2019, and from a distance, that building looks relatively reasonable in terms of a refurbishment of a locally listed building. Ignore the crane, by the way, that was there just to move this narrowboat off the system, I suspect. So CRT clearly still have the use of this wharf by agreement on occasion. But when you look more closely, things aren't really as they should be. The chimney stacks are missing. And these windows, in fact, are UPVC instead of timber sash frames. And the glazing bars are in the cavity of the double glazed units. And furthermore, if you go around the corner, this is the towpath leading up to the bridge. This should have, in fact, have been a green fence, and in fact they just put up palisade fencing and double stack containers, again without permission. And when I've raised this with the local authority, the planning enforcement people say it's not in public interest to take legal action. And I think the planning team really say they think they've got the best out of it they could. Another conservation area, this is in Uxbridge, it's the Uxbridge Moor Conservation Area. A rather nice group of 3 buildings. This is the General Elliot Public House, this is listed. Uxbridge Dock, historically important because this was the Fellows Morton and Clayton boat yard, where they made much of their fleet. And then a much later building, very utilitarian, a covered timber warehouse. And you can see here sliding doors. Clearly this wharf edge was used to deliver timber by barge. And in 2003, an application was made to build a residential scheme on the site. And it was turned down because it was felt that the noise from the boatyard would affect the residents here. And that would lead in turn to the boatyard operation hours being curtailed and the whole viability of the boatyard being put into question. So then a series of applications were made in 2014 and onwards. This was the first one. You can see here this was in 3 blocks, and this block actually had windows facing the covered dock. So the noise would have been a real issue. We objected to this. And then another one here, which I think a rather misguided use of profiled metal to try and replicate the roof treatment of the covered dock. And in the end, I got a bit fed up with this, and I actually sent the planners a couple of sketches. This is the elevation and a perspective, just really trying to recreate a wharf feeling on the site. And I don't know whether that had any effect, but this was a final application which did actually get permission in 2017. And here it is built. And what they've done is they have put a bit of commercial in here as a buffer against the dock. They also paid to have the roof of the dock recovered and insulated. And in many ways, it's probably better than we might have got. Brentford Basin, another scheme that is on running for many years, and you see here a view of the covered warehouses, the iconic covered warehouses. They're not listed, but they are within the front of these are within the conservation area, and this is the Brentford Lock West scheme, which is partially complete in 2018. Now, the Brentford Lock West scheme is actually being built by Waterside Places, and that's a joint venture between Muse Developments and the Canal and River Trust. It was formerly known as ISIS and had its name changed. And in those days, of course, it was linked with British Waterways. But it's a joint venture company where the 50% of the profits go back to the Canal and River Trust. So this is a map of the conservation area. You can see the red line here, and this is the roof of the overhanging warehouse. Now, what that means is that they needed planning permission to demolish the warehouse. They couldn't just do it. But for that, I think the warehouse would have been taken down straight away as soon as they had the site transferred to them. And so a planning application was put in about 2004, which was turned down, and they went to appeal. And my predecessor, the late John Ashley, wrote evidence for that inquiry, and that was really reviewing the fact that the overhanging warehouse was now a rare example in London. There were very few left. Unfortunately, the planning inspector, although he dismissed the appeal, he came to some conclusions in his report, which you see here, which left it wide open for the developer to come back with a further submission, really to produce something which was provided a more acceptable replacement on the site. And that did happen in 2010 when a hybrid application was made by ISIS with British Waterways Board, as it then was. And at that time, the covered warehouse was part of an outline, and they showed a commercial hub, which was going to be a mixture of boat repair, covered space, covered moorings, workshops, some office space. And in the meantime, of course, the structure of the warehouses was being heavily corroded, and we wrote and complained to CRT about that. They didn't respond, but they passed it on straight to the developer, who came back and said that they weren't intending to do anything that would make the warehouse deteriorate unnecessarily. And of course, that's exactly what did happen. And in 2014, some money was obtained from the Outer London Fund to clad the warehouse, and you can see the cladding here with open timber slats. And when the planning application was made, we actually insisted that the steelwork was protected behind to stop it corroding. But that was made a bit of a nonsense of, because the developer then proceeded to strip the roof off the warehouses, purportedly for health and safety reasons, which again completely exposed the structure. And then finally, 2018, the third phase of this scheme, a planning application was submitted, and that showed the demolition of the warehouses in total, but a replica put up here, left open, obviously so that the flats here would have a view out. Moving on to something much more current, this is on the Slough Arm, which you can see the rather green look along here. And this red line is the old ICI paintworks, which closed down in 2016. And a planning application has been put in by a logistics company to build some very big warehouse sheds along the canal. One of them may be a data center, and then about 1,000 flats in the southern part of the site next to the railway. Now, we've objected strongly to this scheme. We think it's the wrong way round, and so do many other people. The flats actually should be next to the water, and there's no connection between the residential area and the towpath. So people would have to walk out on the road system even to get to the canal. So as part of our objection, and you can see this is the warehousing next to the Slough Arm, a CGI, a kind of blank wall really, alongside the canal, which is a huge visual and damage to the canal. So we thought this was a missed opportunity, and so we put this scheme in with our objection, really to show the site reversed, with the housing moved to the north, and the idea of a canal basin, which works here because of the topography of the site. The main site is about 1.5 meters below the level of the water in the Slough Arm, and a canal basin with a housing wrapped around it. And of course, all of this housing facing the water has a premium. So it means that pays for more affordable housing on the site. And there are much better connections then for it. And there's a route through here to the station, connection through to the towpath itself. So that completes a quick look through some schemes. And I'm going to pass over here to Roger Still, and he's going to deal with the future.
Thank you very much, Ray. No small task dealing with the future. I don't have a crystal ball, but I'll see what I can do. So there we have it, a great range of different projects that Ray has shown you as examples within our branch area. And as you will have seen, these range from relatively small scale, local immediate impact in terms of timescale. To give one or two examples, we've dealt with planning applications, an advertising hoarding on the side of a pub, extension to a house. But we're also, as you've seen, dealing with some much larger projects. And these are have a significant scale, branch regional level, much wider impact once they're developed, and can take place over many, many years. Perhaps the best example of that is the Old Oak Park Royal Development Corporation, OPDC, which Ray illustrated there. And the probable time span to develop that is 20 to 30 years. So this is asking planners and designers to look ahead over that very long time span and try to peer into the future and come up with plans now that will make sense and will be sustainable and viable. When we deal with these projects, there's two aspects to it that are important. First of all, they're all unique. There are no planning applications that are exactly the same. In some way, be it location or scale or the type of development, they are unique. And the second point is that when we have a limited time to respond, so we find a project that's relevant, perhaps on that CRT list that Ray was mentioning, perhaps through other sources. And typically we'll have 4 weeks, 6 weeks to look at these things. And you can imagine with these larger projects, you could have hundreds of documents to go through, special reports and environmental assessments and very, very complex documentation. But we only have a very narrow timescale to be able to respond. And so we then have to consider the topics that are involved. And these are some of the areas. Ray has already mentioned some of these. In fact, I would think most of them at one point or another have come up in his presentation related to one project or another. The national planning system, the regional planning system, the London Plan, London boroughs, design, which is urban planning and architecture, and all of these other factors. And each one of these topics may or may not apply to a given planning application or to a consultation, for example, in the case of the Heathrow extension. So we try to look at these topics, see what is relevant to a given project, and then consider the impact on the project, and in some cases what the trends are and what the future holds, which would guide design and planning. So we're trying to respond with these topics and with a view to the future. So we have these elements, the projects, the various topics that relate to them, and future trends. And I thought what I'd just do very briefly is to give a couple of examples. And the examples that I thought I would mention, first of all, is the one which I probably will have come through fairly forcibly to you in Ray's presentation, which is the sheer scale of development that's taking place. The impact of new development along, and here I concentrate mainly on the 13 miles of the Paddington Arm, because as it goes west, it is more rural. But along the Paddington Arm, there are various estimates of just how many new properties, mainly residential houses, are going to be built. And in the broader corridor that follows the line of the canal, it's somewhere in the order of 50 to 100,000 new homes over the next 20 years or so. Plus, of course, you may well have an influence from the catchment areas beyond that line. So it's a very significant increase in population density. And this obviously has an impact on the infrastructure, and the infrastructure in all senses, be it healthcare or transport or education. Well, one of them, and that particularly is relevant to us, to canals, to waterways, is the trend towards what is called active travel, also known, I see now in the latest documents, called sustainable travel. And this is where we have two things happening along the Paddington Arm, as an example. One is the increase in development, which you've seen. And secondly, a government-sponsored intent for the future are certainly well described in the London plan, to encourage, if that's the right word, people to change their behaviour. And what I mean by that is to reduce reliance on private vehicles and increase the use of public transport, walking and cycling. So if you take these things together, the increased density and this intention, what impact will it have over the next 5, 10, 20 years on the Paddington Arm? And this is something that has been exercising us. We think that a provision will have to be made. If we go to the next slide, you'll see, and I come back here to the OPDC. Partly I use OPDC because of the scale of the project and the fact that it is at an early stage. As Ray has mentioned, it's clearly going through some major issues which will change its course, its design, its planning, but it's at a relatively early master planning phase. And so it's got this 20 to 30 year life ahead of it. So for us, this is an opportunity to get involved at an early stage and try to do what we can to protect the interests of the Grand Union, which runs through the Development Corporation area for a distance of something like 4 kilometres. So it's going to have a major effect. This slide shows you one of the sections that appears in the local plan of OPDC. And as you can see, this more or less represents the current upgrade of the towpath through West London to what is known as quiet ways. That is from the old narrow and often in poor condition towpath to something that is wider, a little more generous, leaving, as you see, a ½ metre verge between the edge of the paved pathway and the canal edge, and hopefully on the other side, so some landscaping and green space, depending on location. Now, this is the improvement that is being made now and is being progressed, as I say, through West London. But how long will this be valid for? With this, this double whammy, if you like, of increased density, increases, the increase that we can see in active travel, walking, cycling, this is going to be affected. And this is something that we have commented on a number of times at the various public consultation stages of OPDC. And we think there will be significant improvements in infrastructure to the canal built into the master plan in terms of access and the area parallel to the canal itself, and possibly in some areas a separated path, cycle path, at some point in the future. But the point of mentioning all this is to say that it involves a number of these different topics that I mentioned earlier, and it's an attempt to look into the future to see what will happen, what sort of demand will be placed along the waterway corridor, and how the infrastructure might evolve in the light of these. Moving on, the second example I'd like to give is the environment. And of course, the environment is hugely complex and various facets to it. I hope that there's a slide that's going to come up, which is a quote. If it doesn't come up, I will read the quote to you. Okay, I don't see it on the screen, so I'm going to read it to you. DEFRA, which is, of course, part of government, recently wrote into one of its documents that clean air and water, healthy trees, rivers and biodiversity are not just vital for our health, they are fundamental to the prosperity of future generations and to civilization as we know it. Nowhere do the state of the natural world and the actions of government meet more regularly and more critically than in the planning system. At a time when we want to build more homes for growing populations, and at a time when our national resources are under pressure, it's more important than ever that we create the right frameworks to promote sustainable growth. I don't know whether you can see it, but that is the next slide. Now, the inland waterways are only a small, when it comes to the environment, the inland waterways are only a small part of the overall picture. Waterways in London represent only about 2.5% of the land area of London itself. But the environment is an area where clearly action is needed. It's probably the greatest single challenge that we face in the future, since we are talking about the future. And our objectives probably in looking at planning applications and in our own actions is to go beyond simple mitigation, but to find ways to make a positive contribution to reduce environmental degradation. There's a couple of examples that I'd like to mention of this. One is a paper that was recently issued by the IWA on sustainable propulsion systems. A very interesting paper written by a gentleman who volunteers with the IWA. And this looks at different means of propulsion for boats on our waterways and makes various very well-reasoned suggestions on what might happen to the fleet in future. Change towards electric and possibly hydrogen. But in thinking of that, the report says that the technology to do this exists. It's not an issue of new technology to be developed in future. It is more a question of infrastructure, of putting in place a distribution network to get energy to where it's needed on the waterway system. So we possibly can, if we see this as a need for the future, we may be able to influence through the planning system. We may be able to, once industry standards are arrived at for how these energy sources would be provided along the canal bank or the river bank, we may be able to encourage new developments which adjoin the waterways to incorporate these things into their projects and to use the system of planning gain, which is section 106, and in some cases the community infrastructure levy, to fund these improvements. So there is an example again where different topics come into play and we can use hopefully the planning system to actually encourage positive change. Finally, one other thing I would mention is biodiversity net gain. This is new legislation which will tighten against new development where new development causes the loss of nature or natural elements, biodiversity. Now we can imagine that this new legislation, which requires developers to mitigate any loss, and it must be done like for like, so if it's woodland, it must be woodland, it must be local to the area where the loss occurs, and it must be a net gain. It can't simply be replacing what is lost with what might be obtained in future. There has to be a clear benefit, a demonstrable benefit. And I can see that it is possible that where we as an organisation, particularly in urban areas, such as West London, are involved in improvements to the waterways, and we are actually as a branch involved in a partnership agreement for the Hanwell flight, we may be able to actually create improvements in, for example, in habitat. And it may be possible in future, I only say may, that we can bank those improvements and seek to offer them to developers to mitigate losses elsewhere, thus creating improvements. I could go on with other examples of things which we can see that are necessary in the future, particularly related to the environment, and where we may be, partly through the planning system, we may be able to support improvements. Finally, in conclusion, I've been involved in planning issues with Ray in West London for about 4 years now. And what strikes me, in contrast, I suppose, with those early days of the IWA, is how the waterways are widely appreciated. I mean, the mood music, for example, in the London plan is very positive. So the existence of the waterways, canals, is not in doubt, in my opinion. It's the way in which their setting will evolve, particularly in areas like West London. That is the area that concerns us in planning terms. And the other comment I wanted to make was that I hope that the conclusion that you'll draw from this presentation is that planning is really not a dry subject. It's an incredibly wide-ranging subject. It has so many different facets. It's not dry and boring. Every project, as I say, is unique. And what we are doing, and others like us in this area, has direct and long-lasting consequences. We would like to, of course, to encourage encourage other people to come into this and work with us to extend what we can do. We do what we can as volunteers, but if we have more people that we can encourage to get involved, that would be wonderful. We can make a bit bigger difference. You don't need to be a specialist, you don't need experience, you don't have to have qualifications in planning. What you need is an interest in the waterways, where they are now, their preservation, and indeed improvement for the future. And we are looking, at least in the London area, to provide training and mentoring for those that join with us in this area. So I really would encourage you, if any of this sounds interesting, whether your interest is architecture and design, or the environment, or heritage, or the planning issue itself, it's fun, it's really engaging, and I'm sure you will find it a creative challenge. So do feel free to contact Ray or I, and we'd be delighted to talk to you. So apologies, I don't know, at least on my screen I haven't seen any slides in the last 5 minutes, but I hope my brief, my third part of this presentation is coherent and you have indeed received it. And I think I would now like to hand back to Libby for questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger, and thank you, Ray. I think that's been a very interesting 45 minutes. We've got some very interesting questions, so I'm going to go straight into those. The first one from Ivor, who's involved in the Heritage Advisory Panel. It's a one for Ray. He says, I'm interested in your comment that the green belt is more successful than conservation areas in protecting the waterways environment. We're finding nationally that green belt is gradually being eroded, primarily for the spread of low-rise residential development. Appreciate any further comments on this.
Well, my experience has been slightly different. Certainly with Hillingdon, I've seen 1 or 2 applications for residential schemes, small ones, on old industrial sites, and they've been turned down as being inappropriate in the green belt. So I think that measure of protection is there. I think the only danger we've got is that in the review of the London plan, there was a suggestion made by the planning inspector that the green belt around London should be reviewed. And clearly what that's saying is basically a review with the potential to release further sites for housing. So far, Sadiq Khan has resisted that, and I hope that stays. But I certainly think the Slough Arm, for instance, virtually all of the Slough Arm is in green belt. And it's what many people would consider low-grade green belt. I mean, it's old gravel pits. There are 1 or 2 breakers' yards and travellers' sites, that sort of thing. But that green belt has kept the Slough Arm remarkably rural. If you walk down the Slough Arm, you could be in the middle of the country.
Thank you. The next one is from Phil Sharp. He says, I'm impressed that you have sometimes put forward alternative development plans. Have these been professionally prepared? And if so, was this expensive and how did you fund it? And there's another question to attach to that. Were these proposals sent to the planning authority or to the developer?
Well, I have to make an admission here that the 2 examples that I showed, I did myself. My profession, I'm a retired architect, so I'm used to looking at schemes, and very often I'm itching to have a go. But I try to resist it as far as possible. I only do it when I really think we've drawn to the end of the line. And no, I don't send them to the developers, I send them to the planners. In the case of the one I've shown you at the ICI works at Slough, I've sent that to quite a few local councillors, the lead councillor and the head of planning. And actually some of them come back to me, not in writing, on the phone, to say they like the scheme very much and it's what they would like to do, but their hands are tied because what's been put in is actually in compliance with the local plan, which is in fact 2010, well out of date. And that's the trouble with the local plans, is things move on. And I'm quite sure, for instance, the ICI site was not a site allocation. It was assumed that it was going to continue as an existing business use. And that's why the warehouse scheme may well get through. It's going to committee now, I hear today, actually in August.
Thank you, Ray. Now this is pertinent. This next one from Mike, pertinent to what we're saying about getting people to get involved in this. He says, how do you get IWA members to volunteer for this sort of activity? What skills do you expect them to have, and how do you train people and support them with such huge and long-term projects across such a range of subjects, e.g. from housing and warehousing to industry?
As I mentioned, it so happens Ray is retired, he was professionally an architect. My own background is in property development and construction, so we do have the advantage that we had backgrounds in our working lives which involve planning. However, it's our view is that sort of background or qualifications are not essential. I think that if somebody would like to get involved, and as I say, please contact us or do it, of course, through head office of IWA. It is such a broad subject that if somebody has a particular interest and goes back to those topics that I was mentioning, such as environment or heritage, navigation, mooring issues, then that's a good starting point. And we would be very keen to work with any volunteer who wants to get involved and try and build upon what they know and offer training and, most importantly, mentoring. When I got involved in the IWA, 4 years ago, and I went to a one-day planning presentation, which happened to be a joint CRT IWA presentation at the London Canal Museum. I think this was 2016. And that was my start with the whole thing. And through, what was really important was that joining West London branch and having the great opportunity of working with Ray is ongoing mentoring. So it's not just a 1 or 2 day training session. It's a much more continuous process. And anybody who gets involved would hopefully have the chance to grow and learn and no doubt have particular interests which they can develop. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Roger. I think I would like to add to that we have been talking in our planning and conservation group about setting up some training for people who would be interested.
Exactly.
And I think perhaps that may need to be in the form of a webinar to start off with, if there are people from all over the place. But maybe any comments people have on that, they could get back to head office for to be passed on to us. Or if you have my email address, which I think most of you can do, please let me know, and we'll take it from there. But thank you for the question. We have another question about this is for Ray. What has happened to the examples which Ray went through, as they seem to be still under discussion mostly? That's from Fiona.
Right. Well, going back to Bulls Bridge, that site is still very much as I last showed it in 2019. I don't think anything more will happen to it now. Sadly, I don't think Hillingdon are going to react and take any further enforcement action. I mean, I would like to have seen the toll house perhaps listed. That's something I think that could be looked at. Although I think Historic England may take the view that it's now been so heavily altered that it's not of sufficient quality to list in terms of heritage. The other ones, well, the scheme at Waterloo Wharf, which was the one in Uxbridge, that's now built out and the flats are being sold. So really that's come to an end. Brentford, they received planning permission for the third phase, although I haven't seen a decision notice yet. And I think what that probably means is that they are still discussing with Hounslow a revised Section 106 agreement in terms of what the local authority will receive from that part of the scheme. But I imagine once that is done, then things will move ahead. And of course, what's happened recently with the pandemic, that has slowed progress with a huge number of planning schemes. We used to have multiple schemes every week. In the last 2 or 3 months, that has dropped right down. And in fact, the last committee meeting we had, I only reported on schemes in Hillingdon because there were no others. They'd stopped. So it may be some time before things get going again. And the one in Slough, as I mentioned, that's going to planning probably in August. And I think the issue there is that the local authorities are all under pressure to deliver housing. They have these targets. And so they are very loath to actually turn an application down, which has got a lot of housing and affordable housing within the scheme.
John from West London branch has asked, what view does CNRT take and or act upon it in regard to planning applications?
They, as a statutory consultee, they actually comment on every application. On average, my understanding is that in any 1 year, they probably only object to about 2% of applications nationally. And generally, they remain neutral, or they say they have no comment on the scheme, but they will comment on the technical aspects of the canal. In other words, the stability of banks. On occasions, they will certainly ask for a Section 106 agreement to be included in order that they get improvements to the towpath as part of the scheme. And we've got a case of that at the moment, which is a very large data centre in Hillingdon, where the looks as though there are going to be substantial improvements, a new ramp from a road access down to the towpath, possibly lighting, because it's in an area that's subject to quite a lot of antisocial behaviour. So that's the sort of comment that CRT make. They generally will not comment on things like density or mass, or certainly not appearance or finishes in their consultation.
Thank you. We've got a couple that relate to boats. First one from Kirsten. You haven't mentioned moorings very much. Do you also lobby for retaining moorings at new developments? Quite often mooring spaces are removed in front of new residential developments. And the other one from Polly, starting with congratulations to both presenters, what impact do you anticipate in the future for the use of boats on the canals of London, with the current predominantly diesel fleet go against sustainable goals listed in local authority plans?
Yeah, the subject of moorings, of course, is subject of intense debate. And yes, for developments, we try to look at the impact on moorings, and if we have a chance to comment or object or encourage a developer to improve things, we do. But in planning, and again, perhaps it's coming back to the point about the trends in the future, it's not just the management of the canal in day-to-day terms. I mean, the management of moorings and the best use. The canal as it is a pretty finite area. There are hot spots, there are other areas where demand is less. What we are interested to look at is not only the situation now and the management of mooring space, mooring strategy, but is also looking to the future is how can we encourage developers and all concerned to look at the possibility of offline moorings, i.e. basins and or marinas or marina basins, depending on your terminology. And the project that Ray mentioned on the Slough Arm is an example where we have objected to what the developer has done. We think it would be a great opportunity to put in a basin with a significant number of mooring spaces. So this is something we are trying to do, which we'd like to advance in the future. And being involved in planning activity is a pretty good place to start. The sustainability,
oh, yes.
Diesel. Well, the thing is that we know canal boats have long lives and they have predominantly diesel engines. I think has been said. The question is what legislation will be passed in future? Will a situation arise where, in a bid to reduce emissions, there will be a program, albeit extended over a period of time, which will again encourage a move, certainly in new craft built, refurbishment or change to existing, I don't know. But I think it's inevitable that over time, that will happen. And I think it makes sense that we give thought to how that change would come about and what sort of process is needed, how we could arrive at accepted standards, and indeed the infrastructure to support it.
Right, yes, sorry, I should have remembered that there was the other bit of the question, okay. Or the other question rather. Mike from the Lee and Stork branch has said views on a planning application can be very subjective. How does IWA reach a consensus view?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I mean, you could say, of course, it is subjective. What we're trying to do at the moment is that we try to be objective in the way we look at projects and the outcome. Do we object? Do we remain neutral? Are we silent? But what we are trying to do in the context of London is to bring the 6 London branches together in a planning forum. And we've set up now, late last year, a regional planning group, which brings planning officers and others from branches together. And one of the objectives of this is to share information and a bit of a forum and talking shop, if you like, but basically so that where there are contentious things or people want guidance to try to arrive at a consistent and sensible policy or approach, that there is the means to do that within our region. And indeed, we can draw on the national resources of IWA where more or wider guidance is needed.
Adrian is asked, does the IWA discuss these development proposals with local canal conservation groups?
I think the answer is generally no. I'm aware of certain groups that, certainly in Hillingdon, that are set up on their website, but I think they're all, I may be wrong about this, but I think they're all pretty much moribund, that they don't actually operate anymore. What we do is we are partner members of the Hillingdon Canal Partnership, and that's a very useful body that we attend meetings every 2 or 3 months or so, and that brings together the local authority, CRT are represented, some local residents as well, so it is a very useful forum for discussing applications and also discussing where things have gone wrong and seeing it, and you know, what we can do to put them right.
I would also just mention, if I may, Ray, that we have for specific things talked to other interested community groups, such as the Kensal Rise Opportunity Area, a group there that have an interest in the canal, and also, to take another example, the Slough Arm with the Friends of Slough Canal, who you know we I think talk to frequently, and we, anything that affects the Slough Arm, we do cooperate on that. So we try to, you know, get a broader picture and get input from other groups. But as I was saying earlier, we'd love to do more. I think that's the answer. Very often it's just limitation of time.
I would like to mention that next month, you've heard quite a bit about the OPDC so far, but we're delighted to say that we'll be welcoming their planning director and members of the team who are going to be talking about the Old Oak and Park Royal Development Corporation and the Grand Union and their future plans. And I think Roger might want to extend on that, expand on that.
Yes, I wonder if this is part 2 of this presentation, and very interesting it will be, I think, too. We've been talking, both Ray and I, about the Development Corporation, OPDC, and we've attended public consultations, and we've been talking to them now for over the last, I suppose, 2-3 years now. And we thought that in view of all the changes they're going through, that we would invite their planning director, a man called Tom Cardis, to come and make a presentation to us. And he's very kindly agreed to do so, to do a webinar on the 28th of September on the subject of OPDC. He'll have 2 colleagues with him, one of which is a gentleman who's been involved in developing what they call their water space strategy, and another gentleman, planner, designer, who has been involved in the local plan, I think, pretty well since the inception. So I think that would be a great opportunity for us to hear really from the horse's mouth where OPDC is, and in particular how it will affect the Grand Union.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Ray and Roger have talked to us about this evening. That is very much what we want to see happen, and see other regions and branches moving forward on this. And the examples of West London show what an enormous amount there is potentially available to look into and to further. So I hope you've enjoyed this evening. Thank you very much for coming. We've decided we'll continue to host London Region webinars on the 4th Monday of the month up till, we won't do December obviously, but so we will be having one next month, which is the one we've just been talking about, and there'll be one on the 26th of October and one in November on the 4th Monday then. So thank you again for coming. Thank you again, Ray. Thank you again, Roger, and enjoy the rest of your evening.